Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. As we always do, we're breaking down the basics of all political issues and current political events so that you get to decide. Today's discussion is all about China, and I'm bringing the questions we all have straight to the expert himself, American lawyer, political analyst, conservative columnist, and author on every major book having to do with China. It's Gordon Chang. He's written Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America, China is Going to War, The Great U.S.-China Tech War, and Losing South Korea, Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, and the Coming Collapse of China. Chang lived and worked in China and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades, most recently in Shanghai, as counsel to American and international law firms. His writings on China and North Korea have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Interest, the American Conservative, Commentary, National Review, Barron's, and the Daily Beast. He is a columnist at Newsweek and writes regularly for The Hill. He's spoken at major universities, think tanks, industry and investor groups, and organizations, and has given briefings at the National Intelligence Council, the CIA, the State Department, and the Pentagon, as well as appearing before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Gordon, you are such an expert in this field. I mean, your bio, your history is just remarkable. You are our nation's foremost expert in this area. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show with me today and helping us have a better understanding about China and their goals, looking at them as potentially a threat, maybe more than we often understand. So thank you very much, sir, for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Kyle. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, let's jump right into it. China seems to be this ever-looming threat to the West. The ambitious, lurking communist foe that's always over there kind of covertly working to expand their world dominance. So let's just start there. Do Americans in general, do you think, understand China as the realistic threat that it truly is?
I think we underestimate the threat. A lot of people will say, well, China wants to dominate the world. And they say, well, we want to replace the U.S. I have no problem with any country trying to be number one in the world, but we have to have a problem with the way China is trying to do it, and indeed China's goals, because China doesn't want to compete with us in the existing international system. It wants to take down that system altogether. So, for instance, Xi Jinping has been trying to impose China's imperial era system, in which Chinese emperors believed that they not only had the mandate of heaven to rule what they called Tianxia, or all under heaven, but that heaven actually compelled them to do so. And since 2017, Chinese officials have been talking about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory. In other words, part of the People's Republic of China. So this is the most aggressive, ambitious regime in history. And we've got to understand it in those terms. They're not competing with us. What they're trying to do is to destroy us.
That's so interesting. So it's great to understand this and know that as such a young nation here in the United States, they are a very old nation in terms of their generational understanding of what they should be accomplishing. That is fascinating. You mentioned a couple of China's goals. What are other ones? What are they trying to accomplish globally? And I guess we should say in the universe, now if we're talking about things like the moon and Mars as well.
Yes, well, they want to, as I said, they want to rule everything, which is not control, not dominate, not exert hegemony over, but directly rule. And that means they want to dominate, control, whatever, everything. And so they want a base on the moon. They want to use that so that they can control what's called cislunar space, which is the area between the moon and the Earth. They want to take down our satellites. They want to be able to do anything they want. And Xi Jinping actually exhibits that because he acts as if there are no restrictions on what he can do. So remember, this guy's behind the fentanyl gangs. This guy spread COVID. We don't know, for instance, we don't know how COVID started 100%. I think it started in the lab. But there's one thing we know 100%, Kyle, and that is once this disease got out into the Chinese public, Xi Jinping made sure that it spread beyond China's borders. So for a critical 5 weeks or more, from December 2019 through January 2020, he lied about transmissibility. His regime told the world it was not contagious human to human when they knew that it was highly contagious. And then while they were locking down their own country, and lockdowns are controversial because, people don't think they're that effective, but by locking down his own country, Xi Jinping was telling the world he thought that was an effective way to stop disease. So while he's doing that, he's pushing Chinese passengers around the world, and he's making sure countries don't impose travel restrictions or quarantines on them. So you put those two things together, lying about transmissibility and forcing Chinese passengers out in the world. And that means that 7 million people outside China who died from COVID, they just didn't die. They were murdered. And that includes 1.2 million Americans. And I know that's a tough word to use, but there's no other way to describe it because he wanted to make sure that they died. And he had no justification for that.
Well, that's why it's so critical that we understand what they're trying to accomplish. And it's just my personal belief that Americans can be naive when it comes to China and the Chinese leadership's goals here. You mentioned they want to own or control the space between the Earth and the moon. Why would they want to do that? What implications does that have for other
Well,
nations?
first of all, from a military point of view, if we don't have satellites, that means we can't defend ourselves against their ballistic missiles, which means we are completely helpless. But also it means that in a conventional war setting, I mean, our military, which is very dependent on satellites for communication, for surveillance, all the rest of it, they'd be severely handicapped. And also, without satellites, nothing modern in the US would work. So we're talking, even apart from military matters, we're talking about American society going back to a very primitive time. As one person talked about it a week or so ago, he said the United States would sort of be forced back into the 16th century.
Wow, that is really shocking and pretty terrifying as well. When you're talking about COVID and these sort of, biological weapons, if we don't understand that we know it was generated in China, we know it came from Wuhan, but if we don't understand that it was part of a plan that was effectuated and weaponized in order to accomplish certain goals which benefit China or to accomplish control or dominance, are we just sitting ducks for it to be happening again? What is stopping them from releasing something else and from us going through this all over again?
Very little is stopping them. Remember, Xi Jinping knows that he deliberately spread this disease beyond China's borders. Um, and the world imposed no cost on China. So why wouldn't he do it again if he can kill another 7 million people? This is a, it's very difficult for us to think, well, we need to impose those great costs on China, but we need to do it so that he doesn't spread the next disease. And we know they're working on it. So for instance, in December 2022, an alert building inspector in Reedley, California, stumbled upon a secret Chinese biological weapons lab. And inside, federal and state authorities found pathogens for at least 20 diseases, including the one for Ebola, and almost 1,000 mice that have been genetically engineered to spread disease. I mentioned Ebola because we know at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where COVID came from, they're now studying Ebola to weaponize it. Ebola in nature has about a 50% fatality rate. But the good thing about Ebola is that it's not highly transmissible. But if the Chinese can either increase the fatality rate or if they can make it more contagious, then they have a disease that could kill tens of millions of Americans. So, yeah, we need to impose those costs on China. And through a failure of political will, we have not done that. So we have left ourselves open for the next disease.
Wow. Yeah, they just came out that when the Trump administration was negotiating with China on the trade deal and they were talking tariffs, that delegation coming out of China basically said during the Biden administration, they pretty much had free reign. There was, no one on the United States side putting any Chinese efforts in check. So, I mean, the hope is that has changed now that the United States leadership has changed. Do you feel like it has?
Well, President Trump clearly has a very different view of China. As a matter of fact, during his first term, he broke 5 decades of engagement policies where American presidents thought it was in our interest to support the Communist Party, and sometimes over the interests of Americans. Biden went back to a more multilateral globalist view, but Trump clearly in his second term is going after the Chinese with tariffs. And that has really changed, I think, the dynamic between the United States and China. So, yes, there is a new view. This is sort of, I suppose you could say it's an evolution of American thinking because after the Cold War, we thought that we could integrate China into the international system and that they would see it in Beijing to be in their interest to support that system. But clearly they did not. As the Chinese regime got stronger with our help, it decided it was going to try to change that system, as I mentioned. And so we've got a very dangerous regime right now. And because of bad American policy, and this is true of all American presidents this century, including the first Trump term, we have taught the Chinese some pretty bad lessons. We've taught them that there is very little cost for just aggressive, provocative, belligerent behavior. So in a certain sense, this is on us.
Wow, that's just fascinating. I want to talk about some of that behavior in terms of what's happened, particularly over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, but just generally how China has sort of infiltrated or taken ground in America. And I mean that both figuratively, but also literally. They have purchased farmland or sent immigrants or gotten a bit of a foothold more recently. Can you tell us about that, about how they have infiltrated on U.S. soil?
China's infiltrated every institution in the U.S. We're talking governments, universities, media outlets, Hollywood, sport leagues, all of it. And this infiltration has been thorough and pervasive. I'll just give you an example. Eric Swalwell, a representative from California. I'm not saying Swalwell did anything wrong. I'm talking about what the Chinese efforts. So China didn't first contact Swalwell when he was on the House Intelligence Committee, where he would have obviously been of great value for China. They first contacted him when he was on the city council of Dublin City, California. And I can't believe that Swalwell was the only person at the Ministry of State Security actually contacted. I think that they've been grooming a lot of American politicians, liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats. So you can see how far down the political system they go to identify talent and then to work with those individuals as they become more senior. And this is true when you talk about all the other institutions in our society. As I said, this is not to say that Swalwell cooperated with China. He was a victim of this, but it shows you how pervasive and how thorough and how determined they are to control our political system, which means that, and we've seen this across the board.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example because when I was talking to our wonderful friend Frank Gaffney about something very similar to this, in that we are trained and conditioned here in the United States to like Chinese people. We like the culture. It's a beautiful culture. The people are kind and sweet and beautiful and not threatening. And we don't ever want to be accused of being racist or stereotyping or making judgments based on the way people look. In certain circumstances, that has been to our detriment, especially recently, as we've heard reports, and you can do a much better job of verifying this than I can, reports that China is sending women who are pregnant or just sending people over into the United States for children to gain citizenship, or really just sending people from China to be here. And as you say, they're in every major influential organization, agency, institution in the United States. Is that happening? And are we just kind of going about our business thinking that we're living in this big melting pot? And isn't it great that, we have a higher population of Chinese Americans now?
Yes, well, we know that there are Ministry of State Security agents and People's Liberation Army operatives in our country that have come across the border, the southern border, as well as the northern border. So, for instance, Border Patrol has been noticing recently packs of Chinese males between 4 and 15, everybody coming across with identical kit. And that is a dead giveaway as to what's happening. This has occurred at the same time we've seen an increased incursions and attempted incursions into our military bases. And also at the same time, we see increased tempo of surveillance, elusive surveillance of our critical infrastructure. So all of these things are happening at the same time. And we've got to be extremely concerned because China is studying our patterns. They're looking at our vulnerabilities, and they are creating the infrastructure to attack America from American soil.
Wow. It's just incredible. I really truly believe that we are very far from having a grasp on this, and I'm so glad that you have been so vocal about it. We really need to get it together and understand what's going on here. Um, we've got to talk about, trade and tariffs, especially because recently there's been so much that's happened. Trump is really opening lines of communication with China, and there seems to have been a big shift recently in terms of just how we operate with them, trade with them, charge them, they charge us. They're very involved in our markets. You just tweeted very recently, China started the trade war and we will finish it. Can you explain that, what's going on, and why it matters so much in terms of America's dependence or past dependence on China's goods and China's investment here in the United States?
If we go back to 2018, when President Trump first put his tariffs on China, a lot of people said, oh, Trump started a trade war. Well, no, he didn't. The Chinese have been waging a trade war against us going back into the 20th century. So we're talking about 4 decades, more than 4 decades of, predatory trade practices, theft of U.S. intellectual property, all sorts of things, violating their trade promises to us. So that's a trade war. What Trump did in 2018 was to start to fight back. And that was absolutely essential. And that's what he's doing right now. On April 2nd, what he called Liberation Day, he put tariffs on the world. And we saw an escalation of tariffs on China, where our general tariff rate went to 145%, and their general tariff rate on us was 125%. There's been a de-escalation where our general tariff rate, both sides reduced their general tariff rate by 115 percentage points. But still, they're quite high, especially when you consider that President Trump, pre-April 2nd, had tariffs on China already, and those pre-April 2nd tariffs are still in place. So our tariff rate on a lot of Chinese products, 50, 60%. We don't know where this is going. There's a 90-day pause on tariffs, which is really to China's benefit much more than it is to us. A lot of people say, well, Trump caved in. Yeah, he might have, but I think it was more likely that Trump saw that we were on a collision course with China, and he gave Xi Jinping an off-ramp before a big fight. And I think that Trump was trying to manage this for the benefit of everybody. So we'll see where this goes. But by the middle of August, when the 90-day pause is over, we'll see if the Chinese have agreed to do what Trump said they agreed to do, which is to open up their economy and to eliminate their non-tariff barriers on American goods. I'm skeptical for a lot of reasons, but we'll have to wait until the summer.
We will, and you've been doing such a great job of keeping everyone updated. I truly hope everybody goes and follows you on socials particularly, and will get your handles for that so everybody can, because I follow you and I think that it is the most, insightful but also easy to understand breakdown of what's going on there. So I'm greatly appreciative of that. And by August we might see nearly every other nation we do trade with already with a deal negotiated with the United States. So it will be very interesting to see where China's at that point. Something again that you've been writing about recently is cautioning the United States to not be too trusting of what we're hearing from the Chinese government, not to just, naively trust that they're going to keep their promises. Do you think that this is one of the ways that the Chinese are very adept at kind of manipulating the West to sort of misunderstand their intentions?
Oh, absolutely. When we look at trade, the Chinese are now saying that they need more than 90 days. And I think what they're going to do is they're going to delay and delay and delay. The thing is that Xi Jinping can't make fundamental changes to his economy. And for him he believes that he has to keep the economy the same way in order to accomplish what he set out to do. Two things. First of all, he's putting together a wartime economy. And the second thing is he's trying to protect core Communist Party interests. He doesn't want to open up the Chinese economy the way everybody else wants him to. So this is a very dangerous situation because Xi Jinping is taking China off the cliff because his goals are unsustainable. And even if there were no Trump tariffs on China, I think he'd have an extremely difficult time because the Chinese economy is right now contracting. And I don't think there's any way out for Xi Jinping. So this is one of those things where the Chinese are going to lie, cheat, and steal because that's what they've always done. They've never honored a trade agreement with us or anybody else. And they're going to continue to try to game the system. And that's sort of a polite way of putting it.
You're being very diplomatic in your comments. They're a single party socialist republic, right? So President Xi could technically, if I understand how they operate correctly, he could just stay in power, essentially. Do I have that right? He can just hang tight in the position?
Well, he can hang tight. When he became General Secretary of the Communist Party in late 2012, he inherited a system which had rules, guidelines, norms about the succession of power and other things. Xi Jinping, and it was very interesting because of those rules, because of the way they operated, no Chinese leader got too much credit or too much blame because every decision of consequence was shared across the factions at the top of the Communist Party. But Xi Jinping, by taking power from everybody else, he broke all those norms, guidelines, rules, and he ended up with near total or total accountability. So Xi Jinping right now, he doesn't have to worry about, what we call an election, because under the Communist Party rules, basically every 5 years, there was going to be an election for the General Party Secretary, and there was a 2-term limit. So Xi Jinping doesn't have to worry about that anymore because he junked all of that. But that means because he is near total accountability, he has an election every day because there are no rules. He doesn't have, other party leaders are not going to wait 5 years. They can get rid of him right away under the system that they've now got. And we know that a lot of people are unhappy with him. So if you're Xi Jinping in 2017, things are great because you're getting all the credit for all the good things that are happening to China. But if you're Xi Jinping in 2022 or 23, 24, 25, and things are not going China's way, then you're getting the blame for it. So my sense is that the China's leader must be really happy when he wakes up every morning and feels his toes. So this is a very, very volatile situation for him. He's got total accountability of a situation that's falling apart.
So it will be even more interesting to see what he does with any negotiations with the United States because he has a lot at risk, right?
Yes, and to make things worse, for the last half decade, he's been telling the Chinese people and everybody else that China's already surpassed the U.S., that we're in terminal decline. So he can't be seen to be giving in to us because that would undermine everything that he's been saying for a half decade. So he's got that added layer of complication.
Gordon, do you think that the current leadership in this administration has a full enough grasp of this? I mean, we've got really strong people in now, like Gabbard and Noem and Ratcliffe and Hegseth, and Marco Rubio's doing a great job. Do you think Trump and his team, who would have involvement here, based on the agencies that they're running, do you think that they see this threat clearly?
I think that they are a lot better in terms of threat assessment than the previous administration. Um, I'm not sure that they see it in the same terms that I do, because I've got a distinct minority view, because I've got a much darker view of the Chinese regime than most people have. But all the people you mentioned, I think, clearly understand things a lot better than their predecessors in the Biden administration.
Well, I would agree with you on that. I think, like many Americans, still trying to parse out exactly what that relationship was between the Biden administration, members of the Biden family, and China, but it certainly didn't seem above board, and it really didn't seem like they were putting America's interests before their own. So glad to see that gone by the wayside. Do you think that we have, with the Bidens exiting the White House, do you think that those kind of inappropriate ties have also left, or is there still some of that needs to be dealt with?
In terms of officials, the old problems of the Biden administration are gone. Because we got to remember that members of the Biden family took millions of dollars from essentially the Chinese regime. And they took it under circumstances that they knew or should have known that these were bribes. So I'll give you an example. Hunter Biden, remember him? Hunter Biden's legal team actually said that they received all this money from China as, quote, good faith seed money. Well, that's essentially an admission of corruption because in the circumstances that the legal team was describing, nobody would pay seed money, especially in those amounts. So the only one explanation is that they knew that this was corruption. This was an attempted bribe, and they took that money. Well, that's not happening now. So fortunately, that problem is gone.
Yeah, that was just remarkable. I certainly remember Hunter Biden and saw a lot more of him than I would have liked to. So glad that that's on the way out. And do you think that there is any holdover in terms of consequences for people like Hunter Biden, or for leverage in negotiating with officials that participated on the Chinese side that might be used going forward?
Well, Hunter Biden and other members of the family got a full pardon from Dad at the end of Dad's term. So, putting aside the auto pen issue, a pardon is a pardon. The good thing about that, Kyle, is that because they got pardons, they cannot refuse to testify before a congressional committee or a grand jury because they can't be prosecuted, which means they don't have any Fifth Amendment rights anymore. So I would like to know what went on. And it's not just the Biden family that I'm curious. I mean, there's a guy named Anthony Fauci who engaged in some pretty dubious activities. And I'd like to know more about those as well. And Fauci got a pardon, so he can't refuse to testify. Oh, by the way, about Fauci, we basically 99.9999% know that he committed 2 acts of perjury before the Senate. When he was asked by Rand Paul, did his National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, did it fund gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? And Fauci in both cases said no. But we know from papers from researchers at the said Wuhan Institute of Virology that were describing gain of function research, they specifically acknowledged funding from Fauci's NIAID. So, yeah, Fauci committed perjury. We can't prosecute him for it. But if he comes back and he again commits perjury, then yeah, we can put him in jail, which we absolutely should do because he's responsible for so much death in our country. 1.2 million Americans.
I believe that out of everyone, Americans want to hear the truth regarding what he said and did the most. And the fact that he got pardoned, I think, just planted the biggest red flag right at his feet. And everyone just zoomed in and said, what did you really do that you need to be preemptively pardoned from? It was really, I think we were so focused on whether or not Hunter was going to be pardoned. And Biden had said so many times he wasn't going to, and then he did. And that was terribly disappointing and for a lot of people, that we weren't thinking that Anthony Fauci would be pardoned. And when it happened, I just think it really inflamed a lot of already growing upset, resentment, and just questioning over what went down. So I hope that we don't kind of lose the scent on this one, that we stop, going after those answers, because you're right, it did result in such widespread death and loss and just destruction to our economy, our culture, our faith lives, people's livelihoods. It was just so devastatingly destructive. So I'm with you on that one. Bringing it back again to Trump and China's leadership, you've got two big characters, big figures, big egos. You recently said that it wouldn't be wise for President Trump to go to China and meet with President Xi because that would read as weakness to them. But Trump is he blazes his own trail here. He thinks that he is above messaging weakness. Do you think that he understands that, and that will actually happen, that he will go that way to China?
Yeah, I don't know what he thinks. And of course, Trump does not message weakness. But the issue is not what Trump thinks. The issue is not what the American people think. The issue is what the Chinese think, because what the Chinese think is going to determine how they act. And it's only going to make them more aggressive and more difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, on this 90-day pause, objectively, the Chinese got the better of the deal, and we can go through that if you want. But the Chinese know that. The Chinese have been saying it. And so they're already arrogant. And for Trump to say, well, I want to go to China. Well, from the Chinese point of view, that just confirms in the mind of Xi Jinping that he got the better of the U.S. and that he can do whatever he wants. I'm not saying Xi Jinping is right. He's not. But that's what he thinks. Remember, traditionally, throughout centuries, it was the vassals who went to the grand celestial court. And that's the way the Chinese in general think. And it's made much worse because they believe, rightly, that they got the better of the United States. Now, I think Trump was being magnanimous. I think Trump let them have a victory because he thought that was the best interest of the Chinese and the American people. But it doesn't matter what Trump thinks. It matters what the Chinese think. And I hope that Trump understands that, because if he goes to China, matter of fact, just saying he wants to go to China, which he did, has made the situation worse for the United States.
Break it down just a little bit more. You offered it. I'm going to take you up on the offer. In what ways do the Chinese leadership believe that they came out of the tariff negotiations and trade deal negotiations on top?
Okay, first of all, the Chinese know that the United States has the high cards. We are the larger economy. China's economy is less than 2/3 the size of ours. They're the trade surplus economy, and trade surplus countries are the ones with everything to lose in trade disputes. Last year, China's merchandise trade surplus against the U.S. was $295.4 billion. The Chinese know that their economy is in distress, and yet, even though Trump had all the high cards, in their mind, they mobilized American public opinion and forced Trump to back down. So that's one thing. But it gets worse. And the reason is, yes, there was a mutual reduction of tariffs. They reduced their tariffs the same amount that we did. And one could say, well, that's just even. Well, no, it's not. Because it was American tariffs that were keeping Chinese products out of the United States. It was not the Chinese tariffs that were keeping American products out of China. What was keeping American products out of China are the non-tariff barriers. And that arrangement that was announced in May that has nothing to do with the pre-existing non-tariff barriers. So China's will be able to sell to the United States. We probably won't sell very much to China. And by the way, the Chinese are really arrogant, Kyle, because they had promised to remove what they did on April 4th, which was an embargo on the export of rare earths to the United States, a new non-tariff barrier. Well, they haven't done that. So what we're talking about is a very, very arrogant Chinese regime, because they know that even though they held the weak position, they got the better of the deal.
Well, it's pretty brilliant. So, I mean, I know they don't play fair, and they're going to do what they're going to do anyway, and not hold up their end of the bargain. But you're right; they did best us on that one. And speaking of that, I mean, we're talking Xi Jinping, we're talking governmental leadership over there in China, but China's a country of 1.4 billion people. I mean, it's massive. It's the most populous country on planet Earth. Do we do a bad job of separating the Chinese people from the Chinese government? Because there's talk of all the human rights violations and the persecution that goes on over there. I mean, should we be doing a better job of being sympathetic toward the people who live there and maybe don't have, the choices or the freedoms that other people do, and separating out the decisions and the actions of the people in the highest levels of leadership?
Yeah, we need to do a better job of that. Mike Pompeo, when he was Secretary of State, July 23, 2020, he gave a landmark speech at the Nixon Library. And he said that the one time when he would get the Chinese leaders most upset at him, and they were upset at him at all the time, which was good for Pompeo. But the time that they were most upset was when Pompeo was speaking directly to the Chinese people. Because the Chinese regime is really insecure, and it's especially insecure right now for a lot of reasons. So, yeah, there's a lot that we could do. I'm very concerned that the United States is defunding Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, because that's the way we talk to the Chinese people. And people can say there are abuses at VOA, and I suppose that's right. But we really need those two institutions to carry U.S. messages, because China's waging a very successful propaganda war against us, against our friends and partners, and we've sort of unilaterally disarmed.
You make a really good point. Voices of America, yes, there were a lot of allegations that it had been completely corrupted and wasn't good, but really should have just been cleaned out and utilized for the good that it was able to message to other nations. It's so interesting. I read this statistic recently that due to its population, of course, there are about to be more Christians in China than there are here in the United States. I know that being a person of faith there is challenging. There's a lot of persecution that goes on. But you're going to know better than we are. Is there a resurgence of people finding faith in China? What do you think about what's going on there?
Oh, for sure. And it's House Protestants. The Communist Party has what they call patriotic churches. There's like a patriotic Catholic church, a patriotic Protestant church, some others. And they're totally controlled by the state. Well, because they control them, and because they, in the patriotic churches, they take down images of Jesus Christ, for instance, and replace them with images of Xi Jinping, people don't want to go to the state churches. So you have the Protestant churches, which are very difficult to control because they're beyond the reach of the regime, because they are illicit, quote unquote. The regime doesn't really control them. And the fervor among Protestants is really very, very strong, and it's spreading fast. And nobody really knows the number of House Protestants in China. Unfortunately, Pope Francis entered into a 2018 agreement with the Communist Party, which has been renewed, which basically surrendered Catholicism to the party. So Catholicism is not having a good time in China, but the Protestants are, because they haven't, they have not come to terms with the regime, and good for the Protestants.
I was just talking with another politically basic guest about this very thing, this cynicization and of the Catholic Church. And the guest was saying he wasn't sure if that agreement was legitimate, but you're saying that it is, that it was actually committed to by the Catholic Church and Chinese leadership. Is that right?
Right, and they extended it.
Wow.
I mean, the agreement, it does exist. There's no question about that. The church talks about it. But China's violated the terms of that, especially with the question of ordination of bishops, and it has gone very hard against religion, Catholicism. I mean, I can't prove this, but I suspect that you have some Catholics who don't want to worship in the patriotic Catholic Church, probably have sort of migrated to two places. One of them is probably there are some underground Catholic congregations, and to Protestantism, which I guess is occurring because that makes sense. But the point is, we know that the House Protestants, the number is just increasing by leaps and bounds all the time, because the Chinese people need something. They want to go beyond atheism, and they're really unhappy with the Communist Party. And so you put a lot of those factors together, and it means that religion is spreading very fast in China.
Well, it's remarkable, but I guess I'm not surprised. You can look across time and see that deep inherent desire for truth, for freedom, for the ability to personally choose faith and to seek that is the most powerful force, I think, truly. So it will be very fascinating to see how that manifests there in a nation that's so determined to clamp down on it and to have control of it. Gordon, I could talk to you all day long, and I definitely want to invite you back on the show. This is just fascinating, and the way that you're explaining it and breaking it down is just brilliant. But let me ask you, as we're wrapping up our time today, we've talked about so many things happening, coming from Xi Jinping, coming from the Chinese government, things that are happening here within our own borders. And I think for people listening to this and getting a better understanding of what China's trying to accomplish, what would you recommend is the best thing that people can do about it? I don't even know exactly how to ask this question of you, but what should we do? Tell us what to do as American citizens who, care about our freedoms, care about the Chinese people and their freedoms. Point us in the right direction, sir.
Well, there are a couple of things we can do. One of them is that whenever we have the opportunity, let's buy goods not made in China. And there are now websites which have, for instance, only American-made goods. So that's one thing. We can urge our legislators to enact what's called COOL legislation, COOL, country of origin labeling. So if we go on to Amazon, we know where this stuff is coming from. We can tell our brokers to sell all Chinese stocks. And most people will say, I don't own any Chinese stocks. But if you own a mutual fund, a lot of these mutual funds are international funds. So tell your broker that if you have to have an international fund, make sure it is ex-China, ex-Hong Kong. In other words, no Chinese stocks, no Hong Kong stocks. That's really important. And then, of course, we can always talk to our people who represent us, both in Congress and as well as in the state houses. Just make sure that, we have rules and legislation that will remove China's contacts in our country, because China uses every point of contact to try to take down our society. So although most people don't want to do this in the sense, because of the factors that you mentioned, we just need to get the Chinese regime out of America.
Yeah. Well, those are all very excellent suggestions and really easily doable as well. So I'm so grateful to hear from you on that. And everyone listening to this, everyone watching this, you've got to go immediately and follow Gordon on X. Give us your X handle, sir.
It is Gordon G. Chang, Gordon Gchang.
Yeah.
And I archive all of my articles for free on my website, which is www.gordonchang.com.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't just go and follow, share it as well, because I think in terms of the information that you are sharing, breaking down, explaining. No one's doing it better than you are. And it's so vital that we have a better understanding going forward of everything that you're talking about. So I'm extremely grateful to you, Gordon. Thank you for taking the time today to come on the show, share all of this wealth of wisdom with us. And I do hope that you will join me again in the future. I'd love to have you back on Politically Basic soon.
I would love to come back, and thank you so much, Kyle.
Thank you, sir. All right. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of Politically Basic, where we break down the basics of all those political issues and let you decide. Be sure to follow us at politicallybasic.com and at Politically Basic on all socials so you don't miss an episode. We will see you next time.